retired cop, Navy veteran, businessman, and investor. It's the Captain Flavor Talk Time Show. The captain has entered the room.
Hi, everyone. This is Anthony Rivera, your show host from the Captain Flavor Talk Time Show, and this is episode number 5, Chicago Crime and the President of the United States. This is a special episode. On this episode, we're going to be covering topics that have been talked about by multiple media outlets. But we're fortunate today to have a special guest. He is an expert and has been seen on multiple news channels. We are going to get the answers to some serious questions. I love to hear that sound because that means that our special guest is on the phone right now, Dr. Darrin Porcher. Dr. Darrin Porcher is a 20-year NYPD veteran who performed multiple functions during his tenure, including police recruit trainer and supervisor. He's a criminal justice professor and nationally recognized as a criminal justice expert. He's a television contributor appearing on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and many others. Here is Dr. Darrin Porcher. Hello, Dr. Porcher. How are you doing?
Hello. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be part of episode number 5 on the Captain Flavor Talk Time Show. There is a serious crime epidemic in Chicago. It seems that the police in Chicago is having a lot of trouble keeping things under control. According to the Chicago Tribune, in 2015, there were nearly 470 homicides and more than 2,900 people shot, a 12.5% increase from 2014, and up a staggering 29% from 2013. Last year, there were 779 homicides. President Trump has selected Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and together they are coming across as wanting to be tough on crime. What are your thoughts on President Trump's approach on policing?
Well, I think it is necessary that the president does weigh in on this issue because we look at Chicago as leading the nation from a city's perspective in the homicides rate, where we look at they have 700 plus homicides over the 2016 calendar year. There are a series of different initiatives that President Trump and the soon-to-be incoming Attorney General Jeff Sessions can embark upon. One of those things is the implementation of the various enforcement agencies within the Department of Justice, the DEA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the FBI. They can create what we refer to oftentimes as a task force, and they can target those hot spots as to why we have the spike in homicides, why do we have the spikes in crime. In addition to that, the chairperson or the secretary, the HUD secretary, which is more than likely going to be Ben Carson, he can also assist in this with the housing, because the housing, a lot of these areas where you're having this predominantly high number of homicides are in places where it's quote unquote substandard housing. So he, as the HUD secretary, can step in and erect legitimate housing. I should say legitimate, but housing that's sustainable for a middle class environment. And that in many instances can move a lot of those I want to say that problemized population from those areas and reduce the number of homicides.
Low income housing are just like grouped up together. Is that what's going on?
Well, a lot of it is generally socioeconomics. Historically, socioeconomics have always played a role in crime patterns, not just in Chicago, but just nationwide. And one of the key points to that is housing. So if you have sufficient housing in a particular neighborhood, you're not going to be as apt to have the violence, because the citizens that are in that neighborhood, if you give them something that's nice, so to speak, they're going to be more apt to maintain it. That being said, it's gonna create a reduction in crime. And I give you an example of a place like New York. New York.
Okay.
We look at Clinton Hills, Brooklyn, and Bedford-Stuyvesant, and even Harlem. We had in New York City under the Giuliani administration, they created what we refer to as empowerment zones, whereas a lot of these areas that were deprived housing locations, they had people that gave them super low interest loans, and they moved in, and with the ownership of these properties, they created a different environment. And we look at the drastic reduction in crime in those places like Bedford-Stuyvesant, Harlem, and Clinton Hills. It was a recipe for success that they could utilize in a place like Chicago.
I see. Okay, but Trump recently released a tweet, and he said that he wants to send the feds in Chicago if crime is not decreased. Like, do you think that's a good thing for Chicago, and why?
Well, I think that it's necessary to have the federal the federal law enforcement agencies partner with the localized law enforcement agencies, meaning Chicago PD and also the state PD. You have a collaboration of different resources, and they can spotlight a lot of these issues. And I think that they can do a far better job. But we have a saying, two heads are better than one, three are even better than that. The more eyes that you have that can spotlight the problem, the more apt that you are to have a successful remedy to the issue. So when President Trump states that he is going to assist or will provide federal assistance with the Attorney General, that is what the perception is, that he would provide the assistance of these federal law enforcement units, such as the ATF, the DEA, and the FBI, and it can spotlight a lot of those cases. Because one of the things, when we take into consideration a homicide rate, Chicago and New York City have the toughest gun laws on the books in the country. However, the problem is these guns are coming from the surrounding counties outside of Chicago. So that's where the ATF can spotlight a lot of these cases, and they can take a lot of these gun running cases federal. And that in itself would assist in the prosecution of a lot of these crimes. And also it could prove to be a deterrent as well. If people know that they're going to get 5 to 10 years for just the mere possession of a firearm, that's going to reduce a number of people that are arrested that have the potential or the propensity to acquire firearms.
So previously the feds weren't as involved, I'm assuming, like before this administration?
Well, you did have the federal government was involved, but I just think that there's going to require a more saturated approach to addressing the problem. You oftentimes you have like these districts. I want to say the federal government, the U.S. attorneys have assistant U.S. attorneys that have a breakdown in the population of the country. I want to say geographically, so to speak. So you have a northern, southern component of Chicago, for example. You have an AUSA, assistant U.S. attorney, that has the northern part of Chicago, and you have an assistant U.S. attorney that has the southern part of Chicago. And they basically have a number of resources that they deploy to a lot of these problematic places in areas such as Chicago. However, it's safe to state that the recipe or I want to say their antidote to the escalation in crime wasn't effective. Therefore, it's necessary to employ greater resources in attacking it.
Yeah, because there was a time in Chicago where there was like over 6,252 guns seized, but there was only like 62 federal prosecutions. It doesn't seem right.
Right, and that goes into you're going to have to up the ante and get more resources, or quote unquote boots on the ground, to address the problem.
I see. So do you think do you think President Trump's wall along the Mexican border will have an impact on street level crime?
Yeah, that's good. That's a real difficult. That's going to be really difficult to quantitate at this stage of the game. One of the things that's been mentioned is that we have, I want to say, particularly on the southern border, there's a large amount of drugs that are coming in, and the drugs oftentimes intertwine with violence and other criminal elements. A lot of the cartels, such as the Sinaloa cartel, the Tijuana cartels, as example, oftentimes moving this stuff over through the southern border. So to produce or erect a wall may, in some instances, prove to be a deterrent. But that would be something. It's kind of difficult to make that assessment at this stage because there's no way for us to quantitate if there was a wall up. Would we see an actual reduction in crime? But I do think that it would prove to be a deterrent for some people. But there are a lot of people who are just going to get the stuff over across the border no matter what. Another thing with another issue with that wall, we're looking at 2,000 plus miles to cover the span of the southern United States, which separates Mexico and the United States. I just don't think there are a lot of places that are feasible. I don't think it's feasible to erect a wall type of structure in those places because you have a lot of mountainous terrains in some places and you have a lot of water. And I just don't know how effective the construction would be in getting the wall up.
Do you think that a lot of drugs come from that side of the border from Mexico, or is it coming from somewhere else?
Well, when we look at the flood of drugs, we use roughly 60% of all illegal drugs in the world are basically used here. You know, they're ingested in the United States, and so. Years ago, I want to say going back to the 80s and the 90s, a large influx of cocaine, for example, was coming from Colombia into the United States. But what the Colombians did in the 2000s is, in many instances, I want to say go back to the 1990s, you had the Colombians that were using the Mexicans as a courier service, so to speak, and moving the stuff over the border. However, as time progressed, the Mexican cartels began to amass, and they now, and as opposed to being used as a courier service, they now opted into becoming wholesalers, and they actually purchased the drugs from the Colombians, and it was a win-win on both sides. Now the Colombians don't have to worry as much about the transportation because the Mexicans are acquiring at a wholesale rate and they're moving it themselves. So that being said, the Colombians kind of stepped out of it and they became more of wholesalers. And then the Mexicans, because when we look at the refinement of cocaine, for example, that's something that happens in places like, in South America. The fertility of the land in Mexico is not as good as it is in South America. So it's the Mexicans were acquiring it from the Colombians. They're moving the stuff here. And a lot of this stuff is coming through that southern border. And how could they stop? The border is one place, but you have a lot of this stuff that's coming through means of submarine, the air. They're becoming far more sophisticated. But the key is we have to stop it somewhere. If we can stop it at the border, that's great. I mean, granted, we have those two other outlets, and that's when we have to rely on our federal agencies, I want to say our military agencies such as the Coast Guard and the DEA to assist as much as possible. But the stoppage of the border is a plus. Okay.
So this next question, Donald Trump did mention in one of his debates, and it was in question. People weren't really sure if that was something that he should be discussing or whether it would make sense. So I was hoping that you can clear this up. So the NYPD utilized stop, question, and frisk method under Mayor Giuliani. Do you believe that this is an effective method in preventing crime? Would you credit that method with the drastic reduction in crime that New York City experienced when it was used?
Well, when we go back to when we think about stop, question, and frisk, that's something that emits from a legal decision that's referred to as Terry versus Ohio, whereas it empowers an officer to conduct a frisk of an individual for weapons, and that's weapons only. It's not just a policy that the NYPD uses. It's something it's a purview that falls within the Fourth Amendment. So the stop, question, and frisk is something that can be employed anywhere in the country, provided the Fourth Amendment is the presiding law. That being said, when we go back to the early 1990s here in New York, Mayor Giuliani, along with Police Commissioner William Bratton, they embarked upon something that was referred to as CompStat. And one of the things was they were now looking at the statistics in the number of people that were being stopped and frisked. And they felt that it was necessary to elevate that in terms of stopping more people on the street, frisking them for weapons and things to that effect. The number of arrests drastically went up because as a byproduct of that. However, when we go back 3 years ago, we had a lawsuit here in New York City, which was referred to as Floyd versus the City of New York. It was a class action lawsuit, whereas you had several petitioners that believed that the NYPD stopped and frisked a disproportionately higher number of minorities, so to speak, and it was unconstitutional. A federal judge, as the judge was Judge Sidman to be exact, she felt that she agreed that the NYPD's use of stop and frisk was an infringement upon the Constitution and it was illegal. Therefore, the petitioners were awarded millions of dollars. That being said, the NYPD then regressed on the number of people that were stopped and frisked. But there was no correlation. So granted, the number of stops and frisks drastically reduced, but it also came about that the cops were still making a gun arrest. So it was proved that there was no correlation between the number of people that were stopped and frisked and the reduction in crime. Now we move into Chicago. Donald Trump feels that stop and frisk should be something that should be used in Chicago. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. Stop and frisk is just a provision that falls within the Fourth Amendment. And any city can apply the stop and frisk principle. But it has to be done lawfully. As I mentioned, the NYPD's usage of stop and frisk was deemed as unconstitutional. And if the Chicago Police Department chooses to stop and frisk more people, it has to fall within the purviews of the Fourth Amendment. And could it reduce crime? It's been stated when we look at the contrast and comparison as the Floyd versus City of New York. That was a class action lawsuit in New York. There was no correlation between the number of people stopped and the reduction in crime. So the answer is, I don't think that if you do stop and frisk more people in Chicago, it will prove to reduce crime.
Okay. Can you elaborate a little bit about what CompStat is?
All right. CompStat, you have 7 major felonies that the FBI tracks annually on what we refer to as a UCR, Uniform Crime Report. That Uniform Crime Report tracks the 7 major felonies, and that's how that's generally what determines if a place is dangerous or not. So annually, all police departments report to the FBI with their stats on the 7 major felonies, such as robbery, burglary, murder, etc. That's basically what the 7 major felonies are, and that's how a department is oftentimes able to spotlight if they're going through an increase or a decrease. So when we go back to the CompStat era here in the 1990s, I want to say 1992, 93, the NYPD said, look, you know what? Let's look at these CompStat numbers and let's see where the numbers are highest, and where the numbers are higher, how can we spotlight this at the time of the occurrence? So if we find that let's say robberies are highest at 3 p.m. in, let's say, Times Square, for example, then what we want to do is we want to flood our resources at 3 p.m. in Times Square for robberies. And they found that this was successful. Now you're spotlighting the problem at the time and place that it's occurring. And that's basically what CompStat was.
If you were the police commissioner in Chicago, like what would be one of your immediate policies to help fix the issues there at this moment?
Well, one of my immediate we can't just arrest our way out of the situation.
Okay.
One of the things is there's a term that's referred to as 21st century policing. 21st century policing is basically law enforcement extending the hand to the community and reestablishing a level of trust. And because when we look at any city, the number of citizens is far greater than any law enforcement agency. So when we take into consideration Chicago, for example, you have far more citizens than you have police officers. So as a police department, you have to utilize your population as your intelligence source to give you information. And that goes back to what the 21st century policing established a level of trust, whereas the citizens are comfortable in giving information to police. And a lot of that evolves around community outreach. The community policing strategy in many ways can be effective because it's not so much as arresting your way out of the situation, but gaining information from the communities that you police. I think that in Chicago, that's something that they really need to ramp up, that community engagement, because whenever we turn on television, we see how the police department and the community have this acrimonious relationship, and some cooler heads need to prevail and get this thing on board where you can have that information exchange. So the first thing, I would escalate the number of, I would elevate the community policing strategy. The second thing is I would engage in a collaborative policing model, whereas I wouldn't just use police, but I would partner with social services agencies, Department of Health. When I say Department of Health, meaning drug control strategies, because oftentimes we look at drug use as an epidemic that's a criminal justice matter. I think we need to rechart that into it being a social services issue or Department of Health issues, and treat drug use as a disease as opposed to something that we just arrest our way through, because oftentimes treatment proves to be, and it's something that's been shown throughout the course of time historically, that if you can treat the sickness, you're more apt to gain success. So community policing, a collaborative approach with police that involves social services and the Department of Health. And lastly, a collaborative component with the federal agencies, because as I mentioned before, the city of Chicago has some of the toughest gun laws on the books. So a lot of these guns are coming from places outside of Chicago and getting into Chicago. They're coming from out of state even. So that's where the federal government and a unit like the ATF can be really effective in tracking where these guns are coming from and try to tighten the noose, so to speak, on the iron pipeline that's allowing guns to come into Chicago. So that's my 4-point recommendation for the immediate address to the crime epidemic that's occurring in Chicago.
Well, that sounds like a recipe to success. That concludes our episode, and I want to thank Dr. Darrin Porcher for being part of our episode. Please like us on Facebook and check us out on our website. I'll talk to everyone later.